116 submarines. Gone. Not in a war that lasted years. Not across different oceans. In a single night, thousands of men sealed inside steel coffins, dragged to the bottom of the sea and the world. Said nothing, no headlines, no funerals, no names. Just silence. The kind of silence that isn't accidental. The kind of silence that is carefully built. Someone made sure you never found out. And the question that should terrify you is, why? Welcome. 2 deep-sea war files were the wars they didn't teach you. Finally surface. Now, before we go any further, if you are new here, please hit that subscribe button. Think of it like this. You wouldn't walk away in the middle of a conversation with an old friend who finally decided to tell you a secret they've kept for 50 years, would you? So stay, subscribe, and don't miss a single story. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city, your country, down in the comments. This story touched every ocean on Earth, and we want to know how close it came to you. It was not supposed to be remembered. That is the first thing one must understand about the night 116 submarines disappeared beneath the surface of the sea. It was not an accident. It was not a tragedy that slipped through the cracks of history. It was erased, deliberately, carefully, and for a very long time, successfully. To understand what happened, one must first understand the world in which it occurred. The year was deep inside the bloodiest conflict humanity had ever seen. World War II had already swallowed cities, armies, and entire nations whole. The Atlantic Ocean had become a battlefield without borders. German U-boats, sleek, silent, deadly, had been hunting Allied supply ships like wolves circling a wounded herd. Thousands of tons of supplies, weapons, and food were being dragged to the ocean floor every single week. The Allied commanders were desperate. They needed a solution that was not just effective. They needed one that was total. For months, intelligence officers, naval strategists, and codebreakers had been working in the shadows. They had cracked German naval communication codes. They knew the patrol routes. They knew the refueling points. They knew exactly where those submarines would be and on which night they would be most vulnerable. The plan that emerged was unlike anything attempted before in the history of naval warfare. It was not a series of individual attacks. It was a single, synchronized, coordinated strike across multiple ocean zones launched simultaneously, so that no warning could travel from one submarine to the next. 116 vessels. One night. No survivors were meant to carry the story home. The operation required the silence of hundreds of military personnel across multiple nations. It required coordination between air squadrons, surface destroyers, and underwater detection systems that were, at that time, barely a decade old. The technology was new. The ambition was enormous, and the secrecy required to keep it buried afterward was perhaps the most impressive military achievement of all. Because here is what history shows. Again and again, it is far easier to sink a submarine than to sink a story. Yet somehow, this one was sunk. 116 crews went down that night. Men who had families, names, and nations waiting for them. And those nations were told very little. Some were told nothing at all. The official records were incomplete, classified, or simply missing. The ocean kept the secret well. And the men who gave the order made sure it stayed that way. There is a certain kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not march through streets. It does not fire cannons. It does not wave flags over captured cities. This kind of power operates in basements, in coded messages, in rooms where maps cover every wall, and where the men inside have not slept in days. This was the power that built the operation no one was supposed to remember. By 1944, Allied naval intelligence had achieved something extraordinary. Through a combination of captured documents, intercepted radio signals, then the brilliant minds working at Bletchley Park in England, they had done what seemed impossible just years earlier. They had learned to read the German Navy's most protected communications. They knew the submarine schedules. They knew the patrol grids. They knew when crews were tired, when vessels were low on fuel, and when an entire fleet of U-boats would be gathered in predictable positions across the Atlantic. That knowledge was a weapon, and someone decided it was time to use all of it, at once. The operation required layers of coordination that stretched across 3 different Allied commands. Aircraft carriers repositioned quietly over the course of several weeks, movements disguised as routine patrols. Destroyer squadrons were rerouted under different operational names, so that even lower-ranking officers did not fully understand what they were part of. Depth-charge supplies were doubled on ships whose official mission logs showed nothing unusual. Every piece was placed carefully. Every person who knew the full picture was a senior officer bound by classification levels so high that even their own families would never hear the details. The strike itself lasted less than 8 hours. Coordinated attack groups hit submarine positions across multiple zones simultaneously. The timing was engineered so that by the time the first U-boat crew attempted any distress signal, the nearest vessel that might have received it was already sinking too. Communications were severed not just by destruction, but by design. 116 submarines did not simply sink that night. They were removed. And the architecture of keeping that removal secret was just as precisely engineered as the attack itself. Casualty reports were fragmented. Operational logs were filed under classifications that would not be reviewed for decades. The scale was deliberately obscured, spread across multiple reports so that no single document ever told the complete number. 116. Hiding in plain sight. Across 1,000 different pages. Silence, it turns out, is not empty. Silence is built. It is constructed brick by brick, document by document. Decision by decision, by people who understand that the most dangerous weapon after a war is not a rifle, not a tank, not even a nuclear bomb. The most dangerous weapon after a war is the truth. And in the months that followed the night 116 submarines disappeared, several governments faced a problem that had nothing to do with military strategy. The problem was simpler and far more human. What do you tell the families? Germany had tens of thousands of mothers, wives, and children waiting for men who were never coming home. But the Third Reich was already collapsing by this point, crumbling from every direction at once. There was no stable government machinery left to process grief on that scale. And the Allied forces who had delivered that grief had absolutely no interest in advertising exactly how comprehensively they had done it. Both sides, for entirely different reasons, preferred the quiet. And so the quiet was chosen. But government silence alone cannot erase something this large. 116 submarines represent an enormous logistical footprint. Crews, supply chains, communication logs, families filing missing person reports across multiple countries. For all of that to disappear from the historical conversation required something more systematic than simply choosing not to talk about it. It required active burial. Historians who have studied post-war information suppression identify a clear pattern. And this operation follows that pattern with uncomfortable precision. First, the records are fragmented across multiple departments, so no single archive holds the complete picture. Second, the classification levels applied are high enough to outlast the careers of anyone who might question them. Third, and most effectively, the narrative that does get told is just interesting enough to satisfy curiosity without revealing the full depth beneath it. The world was given U-boat stories. Plenty of them. Films, books, documentaries about individual submarines and heroic battles. The forest was hidden behind a single, carefully selected tree. There is also something deeper at work here, something psychological rather than political. Nations that win wars are not always comfortable with the full portrait of how they won. A synchronized, pre-planned mass destruction of 116 vessels, crews given no chance to surrender. No opportunity to survive sits uncomfortably close to the kind of total annihilation that the Allied powers were simultaneously putting Nazi commanders on trial for in Nuremberg. The moral complexity was inconvenient. And inconvenient truths have always found it difficult to survive the peace that follows war. So history looked away, not because it could not see, but because too many powerful people had too many reasons to keep their eyes closed. The ocean forgets nothing. That is the one miscalculation made by every government, every military commander, and every intelligence officer who believed this story could stay buried forever. They accounted for human silence. They accounted for classified documents and fragmented archives and the slow erosion of living memory. They did not account for the water, because deep beneath the Atlantic, in the cold, pressurized darkness where light has never reached, 116 steel vessels still rest on the ocean floor, silent, motionless, but present. And in the modern era, they have begun to speak. Advanced sonar mapping technology, developed in the early 2000s, began producing ocean floor images of unprecedented detail. What researchers and marine archaeologists started finding did not match the official records. Wrecks appeared in clusters, not scattered across months and separate engagements, as the fragmented wartime reports suggested, but grouped in patterns that told a different story entirely. A coordinated story. A single night story. Declassified documents released by both British and American archives between 1990 and 2010 added further pieces to the puzzle. Operational orders that had sat untouched in manila folders for half a century began surfacing in the hands of military historians, who knew exactly what they were looking at. The language was careful, bureaucratic, deliberately vague, but the dates aligned, the coordinates aligned, and the numbers, when finally assembled from across dozens of separate reports, aligned too: 116. But perhaps the most devastating revelation was not military at all. It was human. Researchers tracing German naval casualty records discovered something that had been hiding in the grief of ordinary families for 80 years. Wives who had registered their husbands as missing on the same date. Mothers from different cities, different towns, different corners of Germany, all filing their loss within the same narrow window of time. They never knew each other. They never compared notes. They simply waited, in separate silences, for men who had all gone down together on the same night. The families never got answers. Most of them went to their own graves, still waiting. And that is ultimately what makes this story matter beyond military history, beyond geopolitics, beyond the fascinating architecture of governmental secrecy. At the center of every classified document, every fragmented report, every carefully constructed silence, there were men. Young men, mostly. Men who had eaten breakfast that morning. Men who had photographs folded into their uniform pockets. Men who believed, the way soldiers always must believe, that someone back home was keeping track of them. Nobody kept track. History is often described as the story of the powerful, the commanders, the strategists, the politicians who shape the world from behind closed doors. But the wreckage on the ocean floor tells a different story. It tells the story of what happens when power decides that certain lives, certain losses, and certain truths are simply too inconvenient to survive into peacetime. 116 submarines, thousands of men, one night, and 80 years of silence that the ocean finally refused to keep. This has been Deep Sea War Files. If this story moved you, if it made you think, made you question, made you feel the weight of what history chooses to hide, then share this video with someone who deserves to know the truth. And if you are watching from somewhere in the world where the sea is close, look out at it differently tonight. The water remembers everything.